Offshore renewable energy. Welcome to this presentation. My name's Bill Stewart. I gave this presentation on August 30th, 2018, this year, at a breakfast meeting for the SUT Offshore Site Investigation and Geotechnics Committee and the Offshore Renewables Committee in Houston, Texas. So we have, in the world at the moment, falling renewable power costs are making a real paradigm shift in the competitiveness of different power generation options. This includes cheaper electricity from renewables as a whole, as well as very low costs now being attained from the best solar PV and onshore wind projects. Some countries have recognized this and are moving faster to gain the benefits than others. Renewable energy produced in marine or offshore environments is dominated by bottom-founded wind turbines. This talk will present historical data and trends for electricity costs produced by offshore turbines, as well as some others. The big picture of future offshore renewable energy developments in the US will be presented. So we have the global levelized cost of electricity, and we're particularly interested in, of all the technologies, the offshore wind technology. The general trend is that the costs are falling. We're going to talk a little bit about comparisons between offshore and onshore wind. We're going to mention solar PV. Now that's the cost of what I pay for electricity, about 10 cents per kilowatt hour in Houston. Now this is the levelized cost of electricity, and the global weighted average values for CSP, concentrated solar power, solar PV, onshore and offshore wind. So in all cases we see trends coming downwards, but we're particularly interested in the costs at the moment of onshore and its comparison with our main interest, which is offshore wind. Now each one of these circles represents an individual project or an auction result, where there was a single clearing price for the bid at the auction. So the center of the circle is the value of the cost of each project along the y-axis. Now again, here is the cost that I pay for my electricity in Houston. So we're seeing the renewables costs getting far below, even offshore, our particular interest, far below what we're paying at the moment for electricity. Now, this is a learning curve, so how fast are we learning about how to make the technology cheaper? So the learning rate is the slope of these curves, and if we look at the learning rate for offshore wind, we see it's this curve here, and we see the learning rate for solar PV, it's this curve here. Faster decreasing costs with solar than with offshore wind. Worldwide renewables, okay, it's the growth in the new renewable power generation technologies of solar and wind that's pushed renewable power generation capacity additions to record levels. The levelized cost of electricity, this LCOE that I'll harp on about a bit, of solar PV fell 73% from 2010 and 2017. making it increasingly competitive at the utility scale. Technology improvements and installed cost reductions have made onshore wind one of the most competitive sources of new power generation, and this is worldwide. Despite the fact that CSP, concentrated solar power, and offshore wind are in their deployment infancy, these technologies have seen their costs come down. Tender and auction results in 2016 and 17 show increasingly that even without financial support, these technologies will be able to compete directly with fossil fuels from 2020 onwards if the right policy and regulatory frameworks are in place. Crucially, the drivers behind lower equipment and installed costs and performance improvements have not yet run their course. Continued cost reductions for solar and wind power technologies can therefore still be expected. And lots of these quotes are from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. So regional weighted average levelized costs of electricity, we see that again, offshore wind. Now we're looking at countries, so the two blue dots we've got in here, one is Asia and one is Europe, and the red dot is North America. So this is renewable power generation technology, weighted levelized average. Well, we see that our offshore wind is on average very expensive still, but we've only got one real data point, which is Block Island, and that is North America, the red dot. Again, there's what electricity costs me at home in Houston. Now we look at these levelized costs, and we look now at how China and India compare with the rest of the world, all the OECD countries, the oil exporting countries. And we see that the China-India onshore wind, which is how this slide is broken up, we don't separately break out offshore wind in this slide. Compared to the rest of the world, China and India, their cost is significantly lower. The black line is the average, what we expect 2016-17, and the rest of the world is a bit higher. And the OECD countries, well, that's what we pay in Houston, and the OECD countries are somewhere between the rest of the world and China and India. Now, how does the wind weighted average cost in 12 countries compared here, 83 to 2016? Well, everything was getting cheaper in all these countries. So this is onshore wind again, and what we see in America is that we've got a distance measured by this red line that I'll compare with this distance. So this is cost in dollars per kilowatt of installed electricity cost, and we look at that comparison with India, and we see the blue line is shorter in India than the red line in America. So their installed costs are cheaper, and we see also the same thing that China, their installed costs are cheaper. Other countries, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, they are slightly more expensive or about the same as the States. The UK is slightly more expensive installed costs for onshore wind. Now, the distance from port is of interest to me as I'm a naval architect, and the average distance of port for offshore wind farm projects has been increasingly, not surprisingly, from 2001 to 2015. So the blue colours are the 2015 colours, and the reddish colours are the early wind farms. So we're getting up to 80 kilometres away from a port, which is 50 miles, and the distance from port is plotted on the left. The average water depth is plotted here on the right. So these guys are going up to 40 meters water depth. The year of commissioning, and the size of the turbine that's installed is shown by the size of the circle. So we're going up to 6 megawatt turbines in this slide. Now we talk about capacity factors. So if you've got low capacity factor, your electricity is only being generated for 20% of what you could produce if you were running flat out. So in onshore wind, the capacity factor is down in the 20, but it's getting up to the 30% capacity to produce the energy with the structure you've put out there, whereas offshore wind starts higher and goes up to nearly 45% capacity. So the turbine is twice as efficient offshore as it is onshore because you've got a better wind field. The sizes have been increasing. Everybody knows that things get bigger. So the hub heights, the capacity factor we saw on the last slide, we see the levelized cost of wind power. So levelized cost, it's the capacity factor is part of it. This is a result of an interplay of several variables, among which the most important is the nature and quality of the wind resource, followed by wind turbine design and operation availability. Total installed costs. The turbine is usually the largest single cost item in a wind project, although depending on the complexity of the project, its share can be less important. This is even more so for offshore wind projects. The WACC, the WACC, weighted average cost of capital, the cost of the debt, the equity premium of the investor, and the share of the debt and the equity in the project all go towards the final value of the WACC. Operations and maintenance costs. Operation expenses include both the fixed and the variable costs, and they can be up to 25% of the levelized cost of electricity. So you start off with capital cost, and you end up with annual maintenance and operations of 25% of the total project cost. So now the levelized cost, how does that work out? We saw in the previous comparison of 12 countries the basic cost to install the stuff. So now we see that the United States, that little cost at the end of the day, so this is 2016 US dollars per kilowatt hour, we're down there. And India and China are quite similar. So onshore wind, we're a little bit more expensive in the States to install the stuff, but once it's there, we're running at about the same levelized cost. So offshore wind, levelized cost, commissioned and proposed projects, and auction results from 2000 up to 2022. That is what I pay for electricity in Houston And now we see that the auction database, the blue dots here, are all coming in for offshore wind, cheaper than those costs. Now this is a brief sort of shaky video, but it shows the dangers of the guys operating offshore trying to get onto a typical offshore wind turbine structure from the back of a boat. And we'll see this guy here nearly get crushed. If it wasn't for the these big protection area, these bumpers there, this guy would have been knocked into the structure by the back of the boat, crashing up against him. So very dodgy occupation at the moment is servicing the offshore wind turbines with this kind of access. When we design these things, we need to focus on safety of the people who have to operate and install, maintain them. So where are all the offshore wind farms? This talk is given in America, but we don't actually have many wind farms offshore in America, exactly one actually. In the UK, we've got all these wind farms. In the States, we're down here. We're not yet really on the offshore wind map. So the UK, Germany, China, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, they've all got a lot more than us. So the dark blue is cumulative capacity 2016, and the lighter blue is cumulative capacity 2017. So this is the one offshore wind farm in the States, Block Island, 5, 6 megawatt turbines. A lot of policy drivers. Where next in the US will there be offshore wind farms? Concerns with greenhouse gas emission reductions. That's one reason why people want renewable energy. Retiring existing power generation equipment. There's a complex process of building new transmission infrastructure. The States is not like a country in most other countries. Big divisions in the governance between states exist, which means much bigger issues in transmitting power across state borders. So we see now that there's enormous potential in the US, but it's still moving quite slowly. However, it's right on the edge of kicking off. So we've got big figures around 4,200 gigawatts of deployable offshore wind potential, which is 4 times the capacity of the entire US grid. So that's a big number we don't really understand. Nobody can get their head around that kind of number. But offshore wind, it's hoped, will provide 2% of the national demand in 2030. I think that's very optimistic. And 7% in 2050, that's also quite optimistic, I think. Onshore wind, I think, will be quite capable of these kind of numbers. Over 10 gigawatt of proposed offshore capacity in 12 different states on the eastern seaboard is being proposed. Close proximity to onshore wind population centres, so there's a lot of people on the east coast. In general terms, the Atlantic coast is more suited to bottom solutions, and the West Coast is more suited to floating wind solutions, but they'll be both floating and fixed on the East Coast. Some of the places we can see being about to be developed on this map. The Block Island first wind farm is up here. All these places have particular renewable energy activities related to offshore wind, and all these places are potentially going to be offshore wind farms. So some of the challenge facing our growing market, we've got a lot of regulations and permitting in the US. It's a new type of market, so financing a new type of market is a challenge. The infrastructure, the ports, the fabrication, installation, new vessel types is not really in place yet. High maintenance costs, new vessel types required. This is 25% we've seen. There's a technical challenge between connecting states together with grids. Poor to non-existent existing supply chain, and poor to non-existent offshore wind experience, because we've only built one. We have this thing called the Jones Act, and that says you can't trade with a ship that's not built in the States between ports in the States. So there aren't any suitable installation vessels which are within the Jones Act, i.e. they were built in the States. So there's a big opportunity there to build new vessels. There's the aesthetic issue, that people don't like the look of windmills so close to shore. There's radar interference issues, and there's wildlife concerns. So the 2018 NREL report, it's optimistic. 25 gigawatt or 25,000 megawatt planned, with projects totaling 2 gigawatt or 2,000 megawatts expected to commence operation by 2023, according to NREL. They shared this information in their 2017 offshore wind market update, and the update is very buoyed. The strategic investments they're optimistic about. They said, the principal engineer, Walt Musial, said, while many factors impact the US offshore wind market, the wind market surge, state commitments to adopt offshore wind deployment targets and their favorable procurement policies have accelerated our nation's offshore wind market activity primarily along the Atlantic coast. With great strides seen along the Atlantic coast, NREL continues to be a key supporter of the US wind industry as it aims to expand beyond the northeastern states into the Great Lakes, the southeast, the Gulf of Mexico, deep waters off the Pacific, and further into the Atlantic, as you said. But NREL aren't the only forecaster. The offshore wind sector ended 2017 on a slightly ironic note. Plans for Cape Wind, which was supposed to have been the country's first offshore wind farm, were finally shuttered after a long period of uncertainty. But prospects for the rest of the market look better than ever. With the East Coast states vying to build local industries around offshore wind and continuing interest in projects on the West Coast and Great Lakes, Make Consulting now forecasts 2.3 gigawatt of capacity through 2026. So we go back to who's made windmills offshore so far, and the biggest player, the UK, and our little United States. Well, that number, 2.3 gigawatt, that's where we would have to be with installed power in 2026, the red line, and that's where we are at the moment. So we have to have a huge climb to get there. And we got plenty more East Coast forecasts. The Offshore Wind 2017, a conference in New York 2 months ago. Bloomberg New Energy forecasts that the US will have total installed capacity between 3 gigawatts and 4 gigawatts by 2030. About the same kind of prediction. However, the predominant view of the speakers at the conference was that it might be twice that, so a very optimistic view. And again, we see the places where there's real sort of predictions. The New York State, 2.4 gigawatt by 2030. Massachusetts, 1.6 megawatt procured by 2027. New Jersey, 1.1 megawatt procured by now. Maryland, about 200 megawatt procured this year. So in the last few weeks, the DOE has released 3 wind energy market reports stating that wind installations continue across the country and offshore wind projects move beyond the planning process. Technology costs and wind energy prices continue to fall. So this is 3 wind energy market reports. So the total utility scale wind capacity, so this is onshore and offshore, but offshore is nothing, is at the moment 89 gigawatts in the US. So 41 states operated utility scale projects, wind projects. Texas leads the nation with over 22 gigawatts of wind installed capacity at the moment. That's how much generation we've got onshore wind in Texas, 22 gigawatts. Oklahoma, Iowa, California, and Kansas have more than 5 gigawatts or 5,000 megawatts. And further snippets from the Northeast. New York, New Jersey have set goals for a combined 7.5 gigawatts by 2030. New York has solicited bids for 800 megawatts offshore wind by mid-2019. New York State Research and R&D Authority to invest $15 million in developing the wind force and infrastructure necessary to support the offshore wind industry. So it's so important to keep the wind infrastructure development going. It's starting, it needs to increase. Virginia is hoping it happens here. We've hosted numerous visitors, said John Reinhardt, Chief Executive of the Port of Virginia. New London, Connecticut is meeting regularly with Deepwater Wind, a developer planning Revolution Wind, which is an offshore project which will serve Connecticut and Rhode Island. So Deepwater Wind has already promised to invest $15 million in New London State Pier, as well as $40 million for 2 ports in Rhode Island. So we're seeing these little bits of investment in infrastructure and ports. The reality is we're going to need lots of ports, said Jeff Grabowski, Chief Executive of Deepwater Wind, which they developed the Block Island wind farm. So recent examples of improvements to the supply chain. Business Network for Offshore Wind's partnered with New York, New Jersey, Maryland in the United States to help them develop offshore wind projects. Networks dedicated to bringing offshore wind supply chain practitioners in all 4 states together and encouraging them to work together. Organization is working with the New York State Energy R&D, NREL, to assist with supply chain database. All these little snippets, you keep seeing supply chain communications, offshore wind supply chain service industry, global offshore wind supply chain. All these things happening and will make the offshore wind a reality faster, and it'll be explosive growth. NREL is developing a new set of offshore standards and guidelines. ABS is working with them on that. An ABS chap came up to me after the talk I gave and discussed some of the things that NREL is pushing for. So when states can aggregate projects together and provide developers with scale, the industry can achieve more favorable financing and supply chain economies, driving costs down further. So that's the end of what I presented. There were quite a few questions, and my thanks to all of you who've listened to this presentation.